This human nerd avoided all orcs, but Oblivious, this orc girl, followed him home. Fear has a smell, apparently. Walter discovered this unfortunate fact at age 7 when an orc merchant passed by his family's bookshop. The orc had smiled, actually smiled, with what Walter would later learn was genuine friendliness, but 7-year-old Walter had frozen like a rabbit spotting a wolf. The orc's smile had faded. He'd nodded politely and moved on, and Walter had spent the next hour shaking so hard his mother had to hold him. 17 years later, Walter still took the long way home. The direct route from the village market to his cottage was 400 yards, straight shot. You could walk it in 5 minutes if you didn't dawdle. But the direct route went past the Orc district, past the leather workers and metal workers, and the handful of Orc families who'd settled in Millhaven after the last treaty. So Walter didn't take the direct route. He took the scenic route. The extremely scenic route that added 20 minutes and required navigating an alley that smelled like someone had declared war on personal hygiene. But no orcs. Walter's fear was the practical kind, the kind built on solid foundation. His father had been a scholar too, one of the kingdom's best cartographers. Had been, past tense, because 17 years ago his father had been in the wrong place during the wrong raid. Walter had been 7, old enough to understand gone, but too young to understand forever. His mother never talked about it. She just kept his father's broken quill pen on the mantel, like some families kept flowers at graves. So Walter avoided orcs. All orcs. Every orc. It wasn't personal. It was survival. He was particularly good at it too. He'd developed a sixth sense for green skin, could spot an orc from 2 streets away, and course correct before eye contact became a possibility. In 24 years, Walter had perfected the art of the strategic detour. He knew every back alley, every side street, every questionable shortcut in Millhaven. He'd once walked through old Master Bernard's herb garden and gotten lectured for 15 minutes about respecting private property, just to avoid passing by an orc blacksmith. Walter was, by all metrics that mattered to him, an expert at orc avoidance, which made it particularly unfortunate that he never noticed when one started following him. It began on a Tuesday, market day. Walter needed parchment and ink for his current project, a detailed map of the Northern Territories that absolutely no one had commissioned, but that Walter was making anyway, because sometimes you just needed to do something productive with your anxiety. The market was always crowded on Tuesdays, good for anonymity, bad for orc detection. Walter had just purchased his supplies from old Judith the stationer, who'd narrated the entire transaction to herself, and then Judith thought, this boy needs to buy better quality ink, but Judith kept her mouth shut because Judith values repeat customers. When he felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the feeling of being watched, he turned around quickly, scanned the crowd. Nothing, just the usual chaos of market day, farmers shouting about vegetables, children running between stalls, a dog that had somehow gotten loose and was causing minor havoc near the cheese merchant. No orcs in sight. Walter shook it off. He was being paranoid. Again. His mother said he had a gift for finding anxiety where none existed. You could worry about sunny days, she'd once told him. You'd convince yourself the sun was planning something. He hurried home, took the long route, the very long route, the route that required climbing over a fence because someone had built a house where a shortcut used to be. By the time he reached his cottage, a small, book-infested building on the village outskirts, he'd forgotten all about the watched feeling. What Walter didn't know was that 60 yards behind him, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone trained to track without being noticed, was an orc. Her name was Ruka. She was 22 years old, stood at a height that made most human doorways apologize in advance, and had skin the color of new spring leaves. She also had what her uncle Grook called the curiosity problem, which was a polite way of saying Ruka had never met a mystery she didn't want to solve, a question she didn't want to answer, or a person she didn't want to understand. And Walter, she had decided, was very interesting. She'd first spotted him 3 weeks ago. The pale human who walked like he was perpetually late for something important, who carried books like other people carried weapons, who smelled like parchment and anxiety. What caught her attention wasn't his appearance. Humans all looked somewhat fragile to her, like they might break if you hugged them too enthusiastically. What caught her attention was his behavior. He'd walked into the market, made eye contact with her accidentally, and then proceeded to take the most unnecessarily complicated route through the crowd that Ruka had ever witnessed. He doubled back twice, squeezed between stalls where there wasn't really room for squeezing. At one point he'd climbed onto a barrel just to avoid walking past where she was standing. It was the most interesting thing she'd seen all month. So she followed him, not maliciously, just curiously, the way you might follow a strange bird to see where it nested. And Walter, oblivious, anxious Walter, never noticed. Week 1. Ruka learned his route home. All 3 versions of it, actually. He never took the same path twice in a row, but he cycled through 3 specific routes. Week 2, she learned where he lived. A small cottage with more books visible through the windows than furniture. Week 3, she started to wonder what he was so afraid of. It never occurred to her that she was the answer. On week 4, Ruka made her first mistake. She got too close. Walter was working late in his study, door open to let in the evening breeze, when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A shifting, a breathing. Something large trying very hard to be quiet and failing, because when you're 5'11" of Orc, quiet is a relative concept. He looked up from his maps, looked toward the window, and saw, illuminated by his lamplight, a face. A green face. An Orc face. A face that was currently reading his discarded notes with what appeared to be genuine interest. Walter did not scream. He wanted to. His body suggested screaming. Screaming seemed like a very reasonable response to finding an Orc crouched outside your window at night. But fear had frozen his vocal cords. Fear had frozen everything except his heartbeat, which was trying to break several speed records. They stared at each other. Walter's terror was the kind that blanked the mind. Pure animal panic. Every story he'd ever heard about Orc raids, every warning, every reason he had for avoiding them, it all crashed through his head at once. Ruka's expression could best be described as caught, like a child discovered doing something they'd been told not to do. Her eyes went wide. She dropped the paper she'd been holding. She said. It was possibly the least threatening, in the history of threatening situations. It had the energy of someone who'd just been caught stealing cookies, not someone caught lurking outside a stranger's window at night. Walter's brain rebooted. "What?" he managed, and his voice only broke a little. "Are you doing?" "Reading," Ruka said, as if this explained everything. "Reading? Your notes, they're fascinating. You spell mountain wrong, though. There's an A in... Why are you reading my notes?" Walter's voice found itself again. Unfortunately, it found itself at a volume that probably woke up half the neighborhood. Ruka winced. "Could you... maybe... not yell? Your neighbors already think Orcs are loud. I'm trying to break the stereotype." The absurdity of this statement, the sheer audacity of an Orc who was literally stalking him, lecturing him about stereotypes, short-circuited Walter's panic. It didn't replace it with calm. It replaced it with a different emotion, confusion. Confusion mixed with indignation. Confusion mixed with indignation mixed with the slow, dawning realization that he was having a conversation with an Orc. He was talking to an Orc. An Orc was outside his window. "I'm going to die," Walter said, more to himself than to her. "What? No, why would you—" Ruka's confusion looked genuine. Her head tilted. "Wait, do you think I'm going to hurt you? You're an Orc." "Yes, outside my window. Also, yes. At night, it's the best time for reading, fewer distractions. Very peaceful." Walter stared at her. She stared back. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The moment stretched like taffy. "How long?" Walter said slowly. Have you been following me? Ruka had the decency to look embarrassed. Define following. Oh, gods. Look, it sounds worse than it is. You've been stalking me. I prefer observing from a respectful distance. Stalking has such negative connotations. Walter sat down. Not because he wanted to, because his legs stopped functioning. He just sat right there on the floor of his study and tried to process the information that an orc had been following him for weeks. Weeks. And he'd never noticed. His entire sophisticated orc avoidance system had been completely, utterly useless. I'm very good at not being noticed, Ruka offered, as if this helped. Uncle Grook says I'm the quietest orc in 3 valleys. That's, Walter stopped, started again. That's not the point. What is the point? The point is, you've been following me. Well, yes, but I had a good reason. What possible good reason? You're interesting. Walter blinked. I'm what? Interesting. You do this thing where you avoid orcs like we're carrying plague. But you study us. I've seen your maps. You know more about orc territories than most orcs do. You're terrified of us, but fascinated by us. It's... Ruka waved her hands, searching for words. It's like watching someone be scared of water while writing a book about swimming. I wanted to understand why. The silence that followed was the kind where you could hear dust settling. My father, Walter said quietly, died in a raid when I was 7. Ruka's expression changed, softened. Oh, so yes, I'm scared, and yes, I study you, because understanding something is the only way I know how to deal with being afraid of it. That's... Ruka sat down too, right there outside the window, like they were having a completely normal conversation. That's actually very smart. Most people just stay scared. Most people don't have strange orcs following them home. I'm not strange. I'm curious. There's a difference. Against all logic, against all sense, Walter felt his fear starting to ebb, not disappear. Fear that had lived in you for 17 years didn't just vanish, but it shifted. Because this orc, this green-skinned, window-lurking, note-reading orc, didn't act like the orcs in his nightmares. She acted like a person. A weird person with terrible boundaries, but still. You can't keep following me, Walter said. Okay, I'm serious. I know. I'll stop. Ruka paused. Can I visit, though? What? Visit, like normal people do. With knocking on doors and everything, very civilized, very not stalking. She gestured at his study. You have so many books, and I'm trying to learn better common. Uncle Grook's teaching me, but his vocabulary is mostly weapon-related. Sword and axe, and the sharp bit that makes enemies regret life choices. It's limiting. Walter should have said no. Should have told her to leave and never come back. Should have maintained his careful, cultivated distance from everything orc-related. But he looked at her face, at the genuine hope there, at the curiosity that reminded him uncomfortably of himself, and heard himself say, 1 book. You can borrow 1 book. Ruka's grin was like sunrise, sudden and bright and impossible to look away from. Really? 1. And you have to bring it back, and you have to use the door like a normal person. No more window lurking. Deal. Absolutely. I swear on my uncle's shiny button collection, which is very serious because he loves those buttons more than most family members. She stood up, brushed grass off her leggings. I'm Ruka, by the way. Should have led with that. Mother always says I have the social skills of a very enthusiastic boulder. Walter. I know. I heard Judith say it. She talks to herself a lot. Does she know she does that? Everyone knows. She narrates her entire life like she's the protagonist of her own epic. Ruka laughed. It was a good laugh, loud but warm. The kind of laugh that made you want to laugh too, even if you didn't quite understand the joke. I like her. She's delightfully weird. You're one to talk, Walter muttered. Thank you, Ruka said, apparently taking this as a compliment. Same time tomorrow? I'll use the door, promise. Very civilized and definitely not creepy. And then she left. Just walked away into the night like this was all completely normal, like she hadn't just upended Walter's entire, carefully maintained worldview. Walter sat on his floor for another 20 minutes, trying to figure out what had just happened. Trying to figure out why he'd agreed to let an actual orc, visit his home. Trying to figure out why the idea didn't terrify him as much as it should. He looked at his father's broken quill pen on his desk, the two pieces sitting side by side, never quite whole, never thrown away. "I'm either very brave or very stupid," Walter told the pen. The pen, as usual, had no opinion. The next evening, at exactly the same time, there was a knock on Walter's door. Not a pounding, not a hammering, a polite, civilized knock that somehow still managed to sound enthusiastic. Walter opened it. Ruka stood there, grinning, holding what appeared to be bread. "Uncle Grook said you can't visit people without bringing food. It's tradition, or possibly just something he made up. He does that sometimes. But I brought it anyway because ignoring potential traditions feels risky." "That's—" Walter stared at the bread, at the orc, at the completely absurd situation he'd gotten himself into. "That's very thoughtful. Can I come in? Or do humans have a rule about invitations? Like vampires? Are you a vampire? You're very pale. Should I be worried? I'm not a vampire. And yes, you can come in." Ruka stepped through the doorway and immediately had to duck because Walter's cottage was built for human heights, not orc heights. She looked around with open fascination. "You weren't exaggerating about the books. This is amazing. It's like a library had a baby with a house. I like to read." Clearly, she was already moving toward his shelves, scanning titles with the intensity of a predator tracking prey. "Can I—" "You can look. Don't break anything." "I'm not that clumsy. I only broke 2 things last week. 3 if you count the chicken, but that was the chicken's fault for being where feet go." Walter's mother chose that exact moment to arrive. She had a key. She used it liberally, especially when she suspected her son was hiding from life again. The door opened. Margaret walked in carrying a basket of herbs, saw the orc standing in her son's study, and to Walter's complete shock said, "Oh, good, you finally got some company that isn't made of paper." "Mother, hello," Ruka said brightly. "I'm Ruka. I've been accidentally stalking your son, but we've moved past that and now we're friends. Possibly. He let me borrow a book, so I think that counts as friendship." "Does that count as friendship? Human social rules are confusing." Margaret looked at Walter. Walter tried to convey with his expression that he'd had no control over any of this. His mother's expression replied that she didn't believe him, but approved anyway. "Margaret," she said to Ruka, "Walter's mother, and yes, that counts as friendship. Welcome. Would you like tea? Is human tea good? I've never tried it. Orc tea is basically just hot water with attitude. Ours has actual flavor. Come help me make some, and you can tell me how my son managed to acquire an orc friend without dying of anxiety first." They disappeared into the kitchen. Walter stood alone in his study, listening to his mother and an orc chatter like old friends, and wondered if his life had always been this surreal and he just hadn't noticed. The week that followed was the strangest of Walter's life. Ruka visited every day, always at the same time, always bringing something, usually food, once a particularly nice rock she'd found, twice a collection of buttons for the Button Shrine, Walter's desk apparently. She'd settled into his space like she'd always been there, like the cottage had been waiting for someone loud and green and enthusiastically curious to fill it. She asked him about his maps, corrected his orcish pronunciation, badly he discovered as she barely spoke it herself. Her tribe had integrated enough that common was the primary language. Told him stories about orc culture that weren't in any of his books. "Most books make us sound like we grunt and smash things," she'd said. "We grunt sometimes, but mostly we just talk, like everyone else. Honestly, humans grunt too. I've heard your butcher. He's basically speaking in grunts." Walter found himself relaxing, not all at once, but gradually, the way ice melts in spring. Slowly, then all at once, then you realize you've been walking on solid ground for a while. Ruka wasn't what he'd feared. She was loud, yes, clumsy sometimes. But she was also thoughtful, funny, curious about everything. She treated his books with more care than some human guests did. She listened when he talked about cartography, like it was the most interesting subject in the world. She was, Walter realized with some surprise, a good friend, which made what happened next hurt that much more. It started with Judith. Judith the baker, who saw everything from her shop window and narrated it all to herself at volume. And then Judith saw the orc going into Walter's cottage again. She'd said to no one in particular. And then Judith thought, that's the 5th day in a row. And then Judith wondered if the village should be worried. The village, it turned out, was happy to be worried. By day 6, people were talking. Quiet conversations that stopped when Walter walked by, looks that lasted a bit too long. His mother reported that old Bernard had asked her if everything was all right with the boy. The concern was always phrased politely, but underneath it was something else, suspicion, unease, the kind of discomfort that came from someone breaking unspoken rules. Humans didn't befriend orcs. Not really, not one-on-one. Sure, they traded with them, worked alongside them sometimes. But friendship, that was different. That was crossing a line that most people didn't even know existed until someone stepped over it. Walter tried to ignore it. Ruka hadn't noticed yet, probably because she was oblivious to most social cues that didn't involve people directly throwing things at her. She was too busy enthusiastically learning about human history and teaching Walter orc swear words. You can't go through life knowing only polite words, she'd insisted. Sometimes you need to tell the universe to go sit on a cactus. On day 8, the village stopped being subtle. Walter was in the market when he heard it, not meant for his ears, but loud enough anyway. 2 farmers talking near the vegetable stalls. Unnatural is what it is. His father would be ashamed. Maybe someone should talk to him before it becomes a problem. Walter's stomach turned to ice. He looked up, found one of the farmers staring at him. The man didn't look away, just held the gaze, challenging, daring Walter to respond. Walter didn't. He bought his vegetables and left. Took the long way home even though he didn't need to anymore, even though the short route was empty. That evening, Ruka didn't visit. It wasn't unusual on its own. She had her own life, her own responsibilities. But combined with everything else, it felt like a sign, like the universe confirming what the village was saying. This was wrong, unnatural, a mistake. Walter sat in his study, staring at his father's broken quill pen, and felt 17 years old again, felt small and scared, and certain that the world was divided into safe things and dangerous things, and orcs were firmly in the latter category. He heard the knock at the door, soft, hesitant, not Ruka's usual enthusiastic pounding. Walter opened it to find Bernard standing there, wooden pointer stick in hand, tapping it nervously against his leg. "Master Bernard." "Walter." "May I come in?" It wasn't really a question. Walter stepped aside. Bernard didn't waste time on pleasantries. "The village is concerned." "I know. Do you?" The old man's voice was gentle but firm, the voice he'd used when Walter was a student, making mistakes that needed correcting. "Do you understand what you're risking? Your reputation, your mother's peace of mind, the comfort of everyone who knew your father." "I'm just—" Walter stopped, started again. "She's just a friend." "She's an orc boy. Just doesn't apply." Bernard tapped his pointer stick harder. The nervous gesture was at odds with his steady voice. "I'm not telling you to hate her. I'm telling you to be careful, to think about what message you're sending, to remember where you come from." "Where I come from," Walter said quietly, "is a 7-year-old boy whose father died hating people he'd never met. Is that what you want me to remember?" Bernard flinched. "Your father had reason, so do I. I have reason to be afraid. I've been afraid my whole life. But fear doesn't make you wise, Master Bernard. It just makes you small. And friendship with an orc makes you what? Brave, noble." The stick tapping increased its tempo. "It makes you foolish. It makes you vulnerable. It makes you a target for those who remember what orcs have taken from us." "What orcs have taken?" Walter felt something crack inside him, something that had been holding back years of swallowed words. Or what war has taken, what fear has taken, what pride has taken. My father died because both sides decided their differences mattered more than their similarities. Because humans and orcs both chose to see monsters instead of people, and you want me to honor that, to continue that. I want you to survive it. I'm surviving it by finally living through it. They stared at each other, teacher and student, past and present. The moment held. Be careful, Walter, Bernard said finally, quietly. That's all I ask. Be careful. The world isn't ready for what you're trying to do. He left, took his nervously tapping pointer stick and his genuine concern and his narrow world view, and left Walter standing in the doorway, shaking with adrenaline and anger and the horrible suspicion that Bernard was right. The world wasn't ready, but when was it ever going to be? Ruka showed up 3 hours later. She'd brought more bread. She stopped in the doorway, looked at Walter's face and said, "What happened?" So he told her everything. The gossip, the looks, Bernard's visit, the awful feeling of being caught between two worlds and comfortable in neither. Ruka listened, didn't interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I should stop coming." "What?" "I'm making things difficult for you. I didn't think. I should have realized." She looked down at the bread in her hands. "I do this, get excited about things, and forget that not everyone else is excited too. Uncle Grook says I have the self-awareness of a very optimistic brick." "No." Walter surprised himself with the force of it. "No, you're not making things difficult. They are. The village is. The past is. Not you. Walter, you're the first friend I've made in years who doesn't treat my fear like it's a personality trait. You make fun of me, yes, but you don't pity me, you don't avoid me. You just showed up and kept showing up, even when I was terrified, even when I was rude. You kept showing up." He gestured helplessly. "Do you know how rare that is?" Ruka's expression was complicated. "Your father, my father would want me to be happy. And I'm happier now than I've been in 17 years, so if the village has a problem with that, they can take the issue up with his memory. I'm sure he'd have opinions. That's not how memory works." "I know, but it sounds brave when I say it." Ruka laughed. It was a wet laugh, like maybe she was fighting tears. Orcs crying was something Walter's books hadn't covered. Apparently it looked a lot like human crying, except greener. "You're stupid," she said. "I know. Like, genuinely stupid. Sacrificing social standing for an orc who reads your notes and corrects your spelling." "I know. I don't even correct your spelling properly. I just guess and hope I'm right." "I know." She grinned through what might have been tears. "Okay, but if this goes badly, I'm blaming you." "Fair. And you have to teach me how to make human tea. Orc tea is terrible." "Deal." They sat in his study until late that night. Didn't talk much. Just existed in the same space. Two people from different worlds who'd somehow found common ground in the neutral territory of friendship. Outside, the village slept, unchanged, unmoved. The world that wasn't ready kept not being ready, but inside Walter's cottage, something shifted. Something small but significant, a crack in foundations that had stood for too long, a possibility that hadn't existed before two people decided that connection mattered more than comfort. The next day, Walter did something he'd never done before. He walked through the market, took the direct route, the route that went past the Orc district, past the leather workers and metal workers and families. And when people stared, he stared back. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't heroic. He was still scared. His heart still hammered when he walked past Grook's metal shop, where Ruka's uncle was enthusiastically showing his button collection to a bemused customer. But he walked, kept walking, didn't detour. Judith saw him. And then Judith witnessed something she'd never seen, she narrated to herself. Walter Thornwood, walking through Orc territory like it was any other Tuesday. And then Judith thought, maybe people can surprise you. That evening, Ruka brought her uncle to meet Walter. Grook was enormous, made Ruka look reasonably sized by comparison, and had the social grace of an avalanche. "So, you're the human," he'd boomed, nearly knocking books off shelves with the volume alone. "Ruka talks about you constantly." "Walter said this. Walter taught me that. Walter has so many books he probably sleeps on them." "I don't sleep on books," Walter said weakly. "That's what I told her. Books make terrible pillows. I tried once, woke up with a spine imprint on my face. Very uncomfortable." "The book's spine," Ruka clarified, "not his spine. That would be a very different problem." They were exhausting. Loud and opinionated, and completely lacking in volume control. Walter's cottage had never been so full of noise. Margaret loved them immediately, of course. Within an hour she was teaching Grook about herbal remedies, while he told her about Orc traditional medicine, and they were arguing cheerfully about whether garlic or moss was better for preventing infection. "Your mother is terrifying," Ruka whispered to Walter. "In the best way. She just told Uncle Grook his medical knowledge was charmingly incorrect, and he agreed with her. She has that effect on people. I aspire to that level of confidence. Teach me your ways." The weeks that followed weren't easy. The village didn't suddenly change its mind. People still looked, still whispered. Bernard still tapped his pointer stick nervously whenever he saw Walter, but slowly, gradually, the sharp edges of disapproval dulled. People got used to seeing Ruka around, got used to the idea that the nervous scholar and the curious orc were friends. Some people even started nodding at Ruka in the market. Not many, but some. Progress wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was a baker who stopped narrating her concern and started narrating her acceptance. It was a farmer who nodded at Grook when buying nails. It was Walter's mother inviting Ruka to family dinner like it was the most natural thing in the world. It was Walter fixing his father's quill pen. Ruka did it, actually. Orc crafting techniques, she'd explained. A bone splint, some careful binding. It wasn't perfect. You could still see where the break had been, but it worked. You could write with it again. "I can't believe you kept it broken all these years," Ruka had said, examining the pen before starting the repair. "That's very sad, but also very human. You people are excellent at holding on to pain like it's precious." It was all I had left of him. "You have memories. Those don't break. They just fade if you don't use them, like muscles." She'd looked at him seriously. "Tell me about him. Not about how he died, about how he lived." So Walter did. For the first time in 17 years, he talked about his father. Not as a tragedy, not as a justification for fear, but as a person. Someone who'd loved maps and terrible jokes and staying up too late reading. Someone who'd taught Walter that knowledge was power, but kindness was strength. "He sounds nice," Ruka said when he finished. "He would have liked you now better than you 17 years ago. The you now is braver. The me now is friends with an orc who stalked him." "Exactly. Takes courage to befriend your fear. Takes wisdom to fix what's broken." She handed him the repaired pen. "Here. Not perfect, but functional, like most good things." Walter held the pen, felt the weight of it, the memory, the possibility. "Thank you. For fixing it or for stalking you?" "Both. Somehow both." Months passed. The cottage that had once been a fortress became a gathering place. Ruka brought friends sometimes, other young orcs curious about books and human culture. Margaret taught Grook to bake. Walter taught a young orc named Shaka to read common. Judith started narrating these events with approval instead of concern. The village didn't transform overnight. Prejudice that old doesn't dissolve in one season. But seeds were planted. Cracks appeared in old foundations, and in those cracks something new grew. Slowly, stubbornly. One evening Walter found Ruka on his doorstep at an unusual hour. She looked troubled, uncertain. "I'm going back," she said. Walter's heart stopped. "What?" "To my tribe, for a season, maybe 2. Uncle Grook needs help with something and—" She stopped, started again. "I'll come back, obviously. Your tea is finally drinkable, and I'm not abandoning that progress. But I wanted to tell you. Before I left. Oh! Walter wasn't sure what he'd expected, but this wasn't it. When? Tomorrow. Tomorrow? Orc timing. We're very spontaneous. It's charming until you need to plan anything. She shifted her weight. Will you be okay without me here? Walter thought about it, really thought about it. A year ago, the answer would have been yes immediately. He'd spent his whole life alone. Alone was safe. But now, no, he admitted. I'll miss you, but I'll be okay. That's not the same thing. Rooker smiled. That sunrise smile. Good. That's the right answer. Because friendship isn't about not missing people. It's about missing them and knowing they'll come back. Will you? Promise. You still have 3 of my books. I need those back. Also, your mother makes better bread than Uncle Grook, and I refuse to live without it. They said goodbye the next morning. Rooker gave him a hug that lifted him slightly off the ground and probably bruised a rib. Don't go back to being scared of orcs while I'm gone, she told him. I'll try. No, do or do not. There is no try. Did you just quote human philosophy at me? I read it in one of your books. Very wise. Also probably plagiarized from somewhere else. Most wisdom is. She left. Walter watched her go, watched her green skin disappear into the forest, felt the absence like a missing tooth, obvious and uncomfortable but not devastating. He went back inside, looked at his father's quill pen, the one that worked now, the one that had been broken for 17 years and was whole again. Not perfect, but functional. Margaret found him staring at it. You did a good thing, she said quietly. I let an orc stalk me and somehow became friends with her. That's not a good thing, that's luck. No. His mother put a hand on his shoulder. Luck is finding someone who cares. Bravery is letting them stay, even when the world tells you not to. You were brave, Walter. Your father would be proud. He'd think I was insane. Those aren't mutually exclusive. 2 seasons passed. The cottage felt emptier without Rooker's enthusiastic chaos, but Walter filled the space with other things. He taught more classes, not just about cartography, but about orc culture, about understanding difference. People came, not many at first, but some. Judith attended every single one, narrating her newfound education to anyone who'd listen. Bernard came once, sat in the back, said nothing, but he came. Progress wasn't dramatic, but it was real. When Rooker returned in spring, bursting through the door without knocking, because of course she did, Walter had news for her. I'm making a new map, he told her, gesturing at his work table. Of the whole kingdom, but not just human territories. Orc territories too, both, together, showing where they connect instead of where they divide. Rooker looked at the map, at the careful notations. At the bridges Walter had drawn between human settlements and orc camps. That's ambitious. I learned from an ambitious orc. I'm not that ambitious. I just wanted to read your notes. And you changed everything by doing it. Walter picked up his father's pen, the repaired one. Thank you for following me home, for not giving up when I was too scared to see what was right in front of me, for being my friend even when friendship was complicated. Rooker's eyes got suspiciously shiny. Stop that. You're making it weird. It is weird. We're weird. This whole situation is weird. Yes, but it's our weird. She grinned, grabbed a second pen. Teach me to map. I want to help, and I promise to spell mountain correctly this time. You won't. You're right. But I'll try very hard, and that's what counts. They worked until late that night, 2 people from different worlds, creating something new together. The map grew slowly. Mountains and rivers, villages and camps, the careful notation of borders that existed and bridges that could. Outside, the world slept, still not ready, still suspicious, still carrying old wounds and older prejudices. But inside Walter's cottage, in the lamplight, with a repaired pen in one hand and hope in the other, 2 friends proved that ready wasn't necessary. Willing was enough. The map wasn't perfect when they finished it. Some territories were guessed at, some borders were approximate, but it was whole, it was real. And it showed for anyone brave enough to look that the distance between different worlds was smaller than fear suggested. Judith saw the map later. And then Judith thought, she narrated to herself, that maybe the bravest thing we can do is trust people who look different from us. And then Judith decided to make that her new philosophy, very profound. Judith is very proud of herself. Bernard saw it too, tapped his pointer stick nervously, said nothing, but Walter caught him studying the bridges, the connections, the possibilities. Margaret hung a copy in her herb shop. So people remember, she said, that healing doesn't always look like what we expect. Grook put one in his metal shop, right next to his button collection. My niece helped make this, he'd boom at customers. Very educational, teaches you where things are. Buttons don't do that, but I still love them. And Walter kept the original on his desk, next to his father's pen. A reminder that some things could be fixed, that fear could be faced, that friendship could bloom in the strangest soil if you were brave enough to plant seeds. Ruka visited every day, still brought bread, still corrected his spelling, still made his quiet cottage loud and chaotic and full. The world didn't change overnight, but it changed, slowly, like ice melting in spring, like cracks growing in old foundations, like bridges being built between places that had forgotten they were connected. It changed because two people decided connection mattered more than comfort. It changed because sometimes the bravest warriors aren't the ones who never feel fear. They're the ones who choose friendship despite it. And somewhere in the space between fear and courage, between different and familiar, between what was and what could be, Walter learned that the hardest maps to create are the ones that chart the human heart. But they're also the most important. Because in the end, we're all just trying to find our way home. And sometimes home is a person who followed you there. Someone who saw your fear and stayed anyway. Someone who taught you that broken things can be fixed, and that the distance between worlds is smaller than the distance between closed hearts. Blood makes you human, Ruka told him once, misquoting an old orc saying. But choice makes you family. Walter thought about that, about his father's broken pen, about Ruka's persistent friendship, about the map that showed bridges instead of walls. Then I'm glad I chose you, he said. I'm glad I chose you too. Even if you do spell mountain wrong, there are two A's. See, this is why we need each other. I teach you spelling. You teach me that not all humans faint when orcs wave at them. I fainted one time. It was memorable. They laughed. The cottage filled with the sound of it, and outside the world kept turning, still imperfect, still learning, still building bridges one conversation at a time. But that was okay. Perfect wasn't the point. Progress was. And progress, Walter had learned, often started with someone brave enough to follow you home, even if, especially if, they were someone you'd spent your whole life running from. If this story touched your heart, if Walter and Ruka's journey reminded you that courage isn't about never feeling fear, it's about choosing connection despite it, then this channel needs you. Subscribe to Orcbound Tales, because every week we bring you stories like this, stories about impossible friendships, about breaking barriers, about finding family in the most unexpected places, stories where orcs aren't just monsters in the background, they're people. Complex, flawed, beautiful people trying to find their place in a world that doesn't always understand them. Hit that like button if you believe friendship can bloom in the strangest soil, and drop a comment telling us, have you ever overcome a fear by facing it? What scared you, and what changed your mind? Your story matters. Your voice matters. And who knows, it might inspire the next tale we tell. Until next time, remember, the bravest maps are the ones that chart the human heart. This is Orcbound Tales, where green skin doesn't define the soul.